So within today's lecture, I'm going to be covering a technique that becomes or raises a set of issues that are very significant when dealing with certain types of problems, certain types of decision problems in the external world. And talking about a technique that marries dynamic models of the sort that we've seen on the one hand with decision tree-based models, models based on a theory called decision analysis. We're going to get a brief introduction to the use of decision trees within today's lecture and see how they can be hybridized with dynamic models, whether they be agent-based models, system dynamics models, or discrete event models. So to motivate this, I'm going to be using two practical examples. And the first of them I just thought of while I was pursuing this material. One of the students in the class had kindly come by my office to ask if I needed any help and remarked on how cold it was outside. I'm going to ask you the following question. So we've long talked about the fact that these sort of models that we use in this class are made to inform decision making. Can anyone give me a sense, concrete sense, in what sense do they inform decision making? In what sense do they help people learn how to make better decisions? Give me a sort of sense of how they could be used to do that. Anyone? Yes.
How you understand the problem better, like what really affects the problem and what is really important.
Okay, good. So at an abstract level, that has a lot to do with it. We need to make a decision about that involves a set of factors that are hard to reason about intuitively, hard to reason about on the seat of our pants, hard to reason about just purely in our head. And just as we might need a crutch for certain types of physical disabilities, we turn to models as kind of a prosthesis, to simulation as a thinking prosthesis, something that helps complement our limitations, helps reduce the impact of our limitations and extend our abilities. Just like a crutch may allow us to walk a long distance we wouldn't be able to cover on a broken foot. So a model can help us enhance our ability to understand the consequences of our assumptions as captured by that model. The model captures the sort of theory about how things might work in the world, and we can see, writ large, what the consequences of those assumptions are. And by so doing, we can learn more quickly. We can, for example, compare it with data that we have from the external world and say, does this jibe? Does this line up? Is it consistent with what we know from the world? And if it's not, we can refine our mental model and refine the model to better capture new assumptions. But we can also use that model to ask what-if questions. So we can ask it what-if questions that involve a representation of policies, of sort of, if we were to do this, if we were to do that, if we were to change the situation out there by putting in place, this sort of mechanism or that sort of mechanism, if we were to be able to, well, you saw it in your problem sets, right? If we could if we could enhance hygienic compliance so that the chance of one infectious person transmitting to a susceptible person was lowered by 50%, what would that do in terms of consequences? Do you remember that example from your problem set? One hopes so. We could ask questions about, with discrete event modeling, if we could place, the location of the resuscitation kits in an emergency room, at a better position. How would that speed up or how would that enhance the survival rate of patients brought to the emergency room with cardiac arrest? It could allow us to ask if we could place clinics closer to people in an agent-based model that's spatially distributed, how could that enhance the likelihood that people will seek care for for regular dental appointments, and thereby reduce the chance of developing adverse outcomes like cavities and so on in their mouth? So we can ask what-if questions. Do you have a sense of that with models? You could run the model assuming A and assuming B. Maybe A is the current situation and B is some change, and you can see how much better is it with B. Do you get that? Do you grok that? Grok or not? Grok. Okay. I hope grok. If you don't grok, come talk with me. Okay? And I'll show you lots of examples. Okay. So we could take these models and we can ask questions. And often that involves trying to find sort of a best policy. Sometimes we may even use optimization. Where do we see optimization before? Riddle me this. Where do we see optimization? I think calibration. We were trying to there optimize our choice of some less well-known parameters to best match, so the model results best match some empirical data. Remember that? But another thing we could optimize would be policy designs. So we could say, how could we, what level of screening should we attain so that we find the best sort of, balance between cost on the one hand and health benefits on the other? We could ask a question like that. You could have some notion of sort of what an acceptable sort of trade-off between those is. So you could ask, how do we maximize dollars per the quality-adjusted life years gained per dollar spent? Bang for the buck. We could ask that. Could we not? Could. Okay. So we can use these models to ask these sort of questions. We could optimize for that. Now, the thing I want to highlight here is some assumptions behind our optimization. So, okay, so great. Sounds terrific, right? We want to optimize our policies. Let's optimize the bus routing schedule in Saskatoon so it gets people to their destination in the minimal time, or at the minimal time and cost, so the fares don't have to rise, but you get to your location in minimal time. That's sort of a common optimization constraint. So we can do these policy optimizations. Great. But I'm going to ask you a question here. Suppose I were to tell you, find me an optimal set of external clothing that I'd like you to wear for every day of the year. What would you say to me if I said, I'm going to give you for next year, I'm going to give you for any year the optimal clothing that you should wear on a given day? What would you say? Okay, divine optimal, okay. In terms of level of comfort. If I said that, I said, I'm just going to give you, for any year, you can apply this schedule. January 1st, you should wear this. January 2nd, wear that. January 3rd, for maximal comfort. Would you believe me? Do you believe that there's a sort of a certain schedule that could be specified that if we have to have some schedule, this one could be the best? Is that possible? Okay. Okay. To really, so it is true that I could probably tell you some clothing to wear on each day that you'd be optimally comfortable. I mean, this is obviously a very oversimplified example, but I could give you some schedule, and there may be some optimal schedule. It certainly does not involve wearing, Speedos in January or something, right? At least for my definition of comfort. But the notion is pretty naive, right? How could you give me a schedule for any given day when for year to year there's so much variability in weather? If you had asked me at the beginning of the semester, what should I be wearing on October 15th, I would have told you, a decent-sized parka. And this year you would have been broiling in that parka. It's warm, right? So you could reasonably ask, well, how can you give us one best schedule? I mean, after all, you can do so much better just by paying attention to the weather and deciding accordingly, right? You have to pay attention to the weather and decide based on the weather. Okay, so this gets to the heart of the sort of problems that we're going to be talking about today. Problems which I call dynamic decision problems, or dynamically complex decision problems, and which are going to motivate a set of techniques that go beyond what we've seen already. I'm going to give you a second example, and this example actually relates to one of the student projects. And it's an example related to a serious health condition here in the province called West Nile virus. Has anyone heard of West Nile virus before? Okay, good. Where have you heard about it? Sorry? Okay, here. Yeah, there's a good reason you've heard about it here. It's because, at least in this hemisphere, we have the highest burden of West Nile virus recorded. We are like the epicenter of West Nile virus morbidity, of sickness from West Nile virus. What else do you know about it? When I say West Nile virus, what do you think about? So, mosquitoes. Okay, it's a vector-transmitted disease. And Saskatchewan did suffer the highest incidence, highest number of new cases of West Nile virus in 2003 and 2007. And our very health region here reported 6.5% and then 25%, respectively, for each of those years of the cases in the province. So this town is pretty hard hit. The province is hard hit. For this reason, local authorities, including our Ministry of Health and Saskatoon Health Region, have worked with us to try to devise a strategy to best fight West Nile virus. How should we devote our resources? Reasonable question, right? We have limited resources each year. How should we devote them to protect against this virus? And I'm going to tell you why that's a more textured problem than most problems that we deal with. So to do that, I'm going to give a little bit of background. Oh man, there's some weird refresh issue here occurring. I'm going to give you a bit of background on West Nile virus. And this is from a slide from my student Karen Yee, who is a veteran of this class and is now doing modeling in Alberta. So West Nile virus involves a mosquito, as people said. It also involves people. That's one of the reasons Saskatoon Health Region Ministry of Health are so concerned about it. It's not merely a zoonotic disease involving animals. It involves people. People can be killed. People have died. Quite a few people have died because of it in this province. A lot of people have become really sick in this province. Some people paralyzed for life. Some people suffering terrible, terrible headaches. So people can get bitten by the mosquito, but the mosquito bites another class of animals, largely believed to be birds, that maintain sufficiently high levels of what's called viremia, virus in their blood, that they can transmit it back to the mosquito. So the mosquito may go bite one bird, it pulls out some virus from it. At a high enough level, it can go, when it bites another bird, it can be given to that other bird, or it can be given to a person. Okay? So the birds can have very, very high levels of virus. And they're believed to be the dominant so-called reservoir species, sort of where the virus lives out there beyond mosquitoes themselves. And there's kind of a cycle between these whereby the mosquitoes get infected from birds and birds get infected from mosquitoes. Humans are what are called dead-end hosts. You can get bitten, you can die, or you can get very seriously ill from it, but it's unlikely a mosquito could acquire the virus at significant levels from you. Horses can die from it, horses can be bitten, but they're also dead-end hosts. Okay, so just a little bit of background about that. Now, we want to understand mosquitoes, and this is a major problem worldwide. Dengue fever, malaria, a variety of other conditions are spread by mosquitoes, and they can cause grievous harm. So once again, we have a refresh issue. So let's talk about mosquitoes here. So mosquitoes go from adults, they lay eggs, So it's, does anyone know what sort of mosquitoes bite you? Yeah, don't say annoying mosquitoes. What sort of mosquitoes bite you? Female mosquitoes. Why? Because they need to get your blood to get the calcium, to extract the calcium so they can lay eggs. So they lay eggs, and these eggs will live in water. Sometimes they can even overwinter. There's eggs out there they're starting to freeze for the winter. Other eggs are just like rafts on top of the water. These hatch into larvae, turn into pupae, and become adults. Okay? And that cycle goes on. And typically in a given summer here in Saskatchewan, we may have 4, 6 of these cycles going on through the summer, each generation getting successively larger for the first parts of the summer. Okay, so that's a little bit about mosquito life cycle. I'd like now to talk about some of the dependencies, because this starts to get to the heart of the issue. It turns out that this cycle, how many times it goes during the summer, the size of the mosquito population, how many eggs are laid, how many bites they take out of you, depends on a bunch of factors. The primary one here in Saskatchewan is temperature. That affects egg laying, how many blood meals they take, how many times the number of bites they get per blood meal, how much blood they're extracting, searching around for a meal, how many meals they need, how many bites per blood meal, and how quickly the pupae and larvae mature, and then how quickly the virus matures in the mosquito's gut. It also depends on habitat availability and rainfall. The mosquito availability to lay eggs depends on finding a place with sedentary water, and it's affected in various ways by rainfall. Okay, so this cycle, in short, is affected by this cycle. Oh, wow, this is really interesting. This cycle is affected by a lot of factors involving factors outside of our control. So let's talk about human dependencies. So for humans, the things that protect them from mosquitoes, well, if it's low temperature and so on, there's not going to be as many mosquitoes typically. If it's a higher temperature, or if it's a lower temperature, also people wear more clothing, and therefore they're less likely to be bitten by mosquitoes. Other things that affect it are they're likely to trying to protect themselves, perceive risk, how risky they think the situation is, and knowledge of how West Nile virus spreads, the fact that there is some risk. Okay, so this is the challenge. This is the challenge of the sort of problem I'm talking with you about. Health managers here have a difficult time grappling with this because year to year it's totally different. There can be orders of magnitude difference in the number of cases seen in a given year from one year to the next. 2007, thousands of cases. Last year, in terms of reported cases, sort of the same type of reported cases, less than 10. Okay? And what this means, the upshot of that is that the best plan for one year may be really wasteful or dangerous for another year. You can't talk about an optimal plan for a given year in a meaningful way without making it contingent. Contingent on what? In other words, conditional on something. Conditional on what? On things like temperature. If the temperature is staying really, really cool, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend money. That could be very wasteful. Take that money away from other priorities. On the other hand, if it's a really warm year and the mosquito population is growing gangbusters, devoting that money for protection against West Nile may be the best way it could be used in terms of improving health. So the issues are that you need to make decisions right now, meaning now at a certain time during the summer, based on uncertainties. Uncertainties involving what the mosquito population are going to do, the environmental conditions are going to do. These things are not under your control. The Saskatoon Health Region has limited ability to affect the mosquito population. It's some ability by draining sources where they can breed, by spraying, etc. But environmental conditions, things like temperature, things like rainfall, are totally outside their control. And what they can do now requires sort of positing, okay, what's going to go on going forward. So I'd like to to highlight for you, ladies and gentlemen, a distinction between two types of problems. The first type is one that we've been discussing through much of this course. You're trying to make complex choices, or choices in a complex situation, a situation you can't judge by the seat of your pants, you can't judge based on intuition, a situation that surprises you, that exhibits emergence. We use different names for it. But here, the idea is that we have a well enough defined sort of understanding of what's going on that we can anticipate that there's one defined set of choices we can make that will be reliably optimal. We don't have to worry about there's all sorts of factors outside of our control that may be very, very different than we anticipate. Instead, we can sort of plan for the typical case, or the average case. We plan on sort of the expected course of things that are outside our control. Maybe it's the function of the economy. Maybe it's factors involving oil prices. Maybe it's rainfall. And those things don't maybe affect our ability to evaluate, or they don't affect the relative benefits of one intervention versus another very much. This is a tough enough problem. We spent quite a lot of time in this course highlighting several methods that deal with this sort of problem. It's challenging. We have to characterize the situation so we can ask what-if questions. People comfortable with that idea? That we're sort of, the idea is that we can depict the situation as kind of the, a standard situation. We could ask, how does intervention A or policy A work relative to policy B? What's the trade-off between them? And that's fine. There may be factors outside of our control that are changing, but they're viewed as not affecting things too much. The type of problem I want to highlight here is trying to make these sort of choices when we can't anticipate the course of, in fact, important factors beyond our control, factors that are really important. It's a much tougher sort of problem, or a tougher sort of problem. We're trying to anticipate what to do, what's the best policy, but it depends so much on things like temperature and rainfall in the future. How are we going to make decisions now if we don't know what these things will do? If those are going to affect which things we choose are best, we have to reason about this. So, with the first type of problem, often we sort of assume some sort of known exogenous condition, some sort of estimate or typical exogenous conditions, and we stick to some preset plan. We say, okay, this strategy is generally best, and we'll stick to it. We don't have to worry about unfolding external conditions over time. We will say, okay, we're going to vaccinate. It looks favorable to treating people, and we're going to roll out vaccination in this way. And, if there's uncertainty about rainfall, it doesn't really affect, the efficacy of this intervention. For type B, okay. This is very odd. For type P problems, the second class of problems, we can't put our eggs all in one basket. We can't typically say, okay, we're going to assume this situation for rainfall will obtain, or this situation for temperature. We don't have the luxury of doing that. It affects our decision-making so much. And so rather than sticking with sort of some estimated typical case, or some guesstimated case that's most likely, we instead are going to need to consider multiple scenarios. Some scenarios where it's hot temperatures, some scenarios where it's cold temperatures, some scenarios where it's medium temperatures. Figure out what's best for each of those, and then observe what's actually happening. Does that make sense? It's kind of like you want to observe what the temperature is outside before you figure out what coat to wear outside. You don't just say, oh, it's November 2nd, I'm going to wear a heavy parka. You look outside, oh, there's no snow, okay. What does the thermostat say? Okay, it's it's 10 degrees outside, fine, I'll wear something light. Okay, so here, rather than sticking to some preset plan, what I should wear on November 2nd, 3rd, 4th, we're adaptively adjusting our choices based on what we observe. The point is, we can't just take a model and say, go figure, what's the best optimal outcome? We have to have them all consider different possible scenarios involving, uncertainties. Does that make sense at a high level? Okay. Now we're going to be working towards how we do this. So this is a textured issue. There's several layers to this issue, because I want you to think about it. Often in these cases, what we're doing, we're not merely examining scenarios. We actually need to make decisions over time. We need to make decisions in the light of changes which are occurring over time. We adapt our decision-making based on the observations. We observe, we make decisions for the short term, and then re-examine the next day, So the question that the health region has, question that the Ministry of Health here has, and that they turn to us to try to address is, how do we figure out what decision we should make now, say July 1st? When the choice of what we do now depends so much on what's likely to happen going forward, and by the fact that in another week we're going to be re-examining this. In another week yet, we're going to re-examine it again and again. We're going to have an opportunity to learn over time by seeing what the temperature does, and to change our course of action over time as this uncertainty unfolds. Okay? So the tension here is, should we make our decisions now? Sort of a stitch in time saves time. Should we act now despite these uncertainties? Or should we wait to see how things are trending before make decisions, at the risk of then being too late to really make a difference? So acting early is good because often it allows you to make the difference in time to offset the risks, to keep the mosquito population low by really carefully draining sources for mosquitoes. But waiting allows you to learn from what's actually happening with the temperatures. You may discover we don't need to do all this sort of work to drain possible mosquito sources. It's too cool to worry about it anyway. So you see that tension? Okay. So let's talk about some characteristics of these problems. With these sort of adaptive decision problems, or dynamically complex decision problems, as I call them, we can't count on one particular future trajectory unfolding. It would be nuts. It would be nuts to say to the province, this is what you should do on June 1st, June 7th of each year, etc., for each week of the year. It would be nuts. They'd be throwing their money away in a cool year, and they wouldn't be spending enough for a hot year. Do you get that? Wouldn't be spending enough to fight the mosquitoes, right? Here, choosing decisions now requires considering these different possibilities and considering the fact that we're going to be re-examining this in a week's time. Here we need to make these decisions over time as things unfold, and it may be advantageous to wait and see often in the course of this, okay? So, if we need to make a decision based at a current time, what is this going to depend on? It's going to depend on our current situation, what we've observed recently in terms of temperatures. What have we observed to this point? Has it been a hot summer or a cold summer to this point? What's the mosquito population like till now? Right? This is going to be quite important. But it also depends on possible future eventualities given what we've seen. Given that it's been hot till now, well, if it's likely to be hot going forward because of that, we need to take that into account. But we're going to have some uncertainty about what this temperature is going to do going forward. And also, we need to take into account the fact that this is not our last choice. This is not our last chance to make a choice. This is not something we have to live with forever. We could decide something now and re-examine. We can issue an advisory now and reconsider the next week whether we want to drain water sources, whether we want to undertake spraying or what have you. So in short, if we wait and see now, we'll have a chance to re-examine it. That option, that flexibility, is valuable often. So here we're balancing these two desires. Seize the moment now, act early, head things off, stitch in time saves 9, or wait and see and learn and then decide on the basis of that. Do you see that tension? Yeah, okay, good. So how do we address these problems? The way we address, one very effective way for addressing these problems, one that came out of our own work, work with a decision analyst, Gordon Kaufman at MIT, involves coupling a simulation model and a decision tree. Okay, how many people in here have seen decision trees before? Okay, 317, do they cover them? No? No. Maybe at a high level? Okay, so possibly for representing AI decision making. So here we have a simulation model. We're going to have a decision tree, and what's going to happen is the simulation model is going to be responsible for computing consequences. Well, let me start with the decision tree. The decision tree is going to allow us to simulate, to represent events and decisions that they will need to be considered over time. Simulation model for a given set, a given sequence of particular events and decisions that have been observed. What are the consequences of that? So for a given set of temperatures over time and a given set of choices by the health region for spraying, you're doing larviciding, or doing adulticiding, or draining water sources, or issuing advisories, or doing nothing, for a given set of decisions for each successive week, and these decisions are made based on meetings every week across the province, the simulation model will spit out the anticipated consequence in terms of mosquito populations, in terms of number of people getting sick for West Nile, etc. Okay? So, in order to make sense of this simulation model can be any of the three types we've talked about. It could be a system dynamics model, it could be an agent-based model, it could be a discrete event model. All of us will work with this strategy just fine. The decision tree, ladies and gentlemen, many of you have not seen before. It's evident. So let's go talk about decision trees. Decision trees are one of the neater formalisms that you'll encounter for thinking systematically about our choices in light. So it's adaptive choices, so choices over time in light of unfolding uncertainty over time. Okay? And so decision trees here will represent the flow of time, decisions, uncertainties, and consequences observed over time. So there's three types of nodes in decision trees. A decision tree is a tree in a computer science sense, so it consists of a set of decision and event nodes. Over time, it'll look something like this. And the blue nodes represent what are called decision nodes. That's the one in the upper right there. Blue is a distraction. They're squares. That's the sort of distinguishing diagrammatic convention. The round circles represent chance nodes, event nodes. Okay? And the bottom one is what's called terminal nodes. Let's talk about each of these things, okay? Each of them has their own types of reasoning and their own sets of things they represent. So this top one, a decision node, ladies and gentlemen, that represents a set of choices that you can make at a certain point of time. Time is shown within decision trees as going to the right, and this decision occurs at a point in time. So it's representing a kind of a choice point. For West Nile virus, this would probably be the weekly meetings, weekly so-called bug busters meetings that the health regions have with other health regions and with the Ministry of Health. And at that meeting, they make a set of they choose between one of a set of choices. Do they spray? If so, is it larviciding or adulticiding? Do they issue an advisory? Do they wait and see? Do they do source reduction? There's a set of choices, and they choose between them. So they choose one of these. Okay, that's the assumption with the decision tree. You're going to choose one of these at a certain time. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is your choice. You can use decision trees to represent any number of different things. You know, your choice of transportation day to day, your choice of how to devote your time or what have you. And the idea is there's a decision. By choosing something, you're not choosing other options. Okay? Next sort of node is this event node. That's shown in this green. And here, the event is associated with different possible outcomes. So like a decision node, it's an internal node in these trees. It has typically several children. Here, a person doesn't have a choice as to what happens. Think of this as temperature and different temperature regimes to the right. So maybe the top one is temperatures less than or equal to 20 degrees Celsius. The middle one maybe is 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. The bottom is greater than or equal to 30 degrees Celsius. These are different possible regimes of temperature that might obtain for mean temperature over a week's time. So this might represent temperature over a certain week. And it is three possible outcomes. Make sense? This could represent something else that's outside of your control. Rainfall, level of rainfall. It could represent, your uncertainty about the weather, right? For going out each day. Okay, the final type of node is this terminal node. It's shown down here in red. And it's also called a consequence node. It's associated with some consequence. It's associated with some outcome that's either good or bad. So it might be cost, in which case more of it is considered generally bad. It could be lives saved, in which case more of it is considered good. It could be number of deaths from West Nile, in which case more of it is considered bad. Generally, we have a polarity associated with it. More of it is good, more of it is bad. For now, we're going to assume that more of it is good. So if you want to represent deaths, and you want to reason about a tree where deaths are bad, you put minus of deaths. So more of it, the closer it is to zero, the better. The larger the number of deaths, more negative it will be and the worse. So we'll try to maximize that. Does that make sense? That'll be desirable. Okay. So these sort of trees are used for a variety of reasons. They're really useful for diagrammatically sort of showing a set of choices, a scenario over time. But the foremost reason people will often use them is to perform quantitative reasoning on them. To ask, what should I do at a certain point? Okay? So if we have this tree here, again, time is running to the right. We have these successive weeks, each associated with a decision. Maybe these are the bug busters meetings. And we have different temperature regimes, shown here for simplicity with just two possible outcomes, cool or hot. Temperature is closer to 20 degrees or temperature is closer to 30 degrees Celsius. Okay? So here, a lot of interest might be in, okay, what do I do now? Maybe now is at the root of the node, at the root node. The node over here to the furthest left, that's a choice node, a decision node, and you've got to decide, what do I do now? Do I do nothing? Do I punt for now and wait a week and see what the temperature does and then make a decision? Or do I commit right now to, to source reduction or to issue a warning advisory? And you see these things quite frequently in the papers in the summer. These are the sort of decisions that might be made at this point. But they know in another week, there'll be another set of choices to be made. So a decision tree here, ladies and gentlemen, will be used. Mark this, because you may have to mark it on your exam. A decision tree will be used to figure out for each decision node what choice will be best if that decision node is best. It needs to be, it's reached. Sorry. If that decision node is reached, which choice should be made? It will give a recommendation for each decision node what choice to make. And generally, we're trying to find what's called the best decision rule, which will say, given any possible eventuality, what should I do? What sort of action should I undertake? That's the sort of thing like the Saskatoon Health Region has done at a very rough level. They said, well, if temperature stays less than, 25 degrees through June 15th, just wait and see. If it goes up above that, start to undertake actions by, starting to spray come June 1st or what have you. So it's a contingent plan. If this happens, do this. If that happens, do that. But generally, in the process, we're going to go through a process called rollback. It's also called backwards induction. It's an application of dynamic programming, which involves associating every decision node with a choice to be made, with a sort of trying to identify the optimal choice. If you reach that point, decide this. So let's give an example. Let's take this decision node here in week 1 at the bottom. This guy right here. What does that situation represent? Well, that would represent a situation where at week 0, at the very start, we do nothing. How would we reach that point, that one that I pointed out there? Well, at first, we've done nothing for the first week, and the temperatures have been high. It's under that situation we might reach this, right? And then the question is, okay, well, so we didn't do anything last week, and we've observed high temperatures. Maybe I should do something this week because I punted so far. By contrast, if I had done aggressive source reduction last week, then maybe if I observe high temperatures, I don't have to do something this week. You see how it might differ, right? Or if in the first week we did nothing but it was low temperatures, maybe then we should still continue doing nothing. So it's going to be contingent. If you've seen low temperatures recently, maybe you do nothing. Otherwise, you undertake some more aggressive policy. Does that make sense at a crude level? Okay, so let's talk about how we would figure this out. So we need to introduce, it's going to say we're going to try to identify the optimal decision rule, but I want to talk about what this decision rule is, okay? So let's talk about a bit of terminology. I've introduced decision nodes, event nodes, terminal nodes. I'd like to introduce a further terminology here, two further points of terminology. One is scenario. I show what this is my terminology more than the uniform terminology. A scenario will be sort of a particular sequence of decisions and events over time. So a scenario might be you do nothing, you do have no expansion initially in your industrial capacity, then there's high early growth in your market, and then you expand capacity, and then there's low later growth, and there's some consequence from this, right? There's some consequence reflecting your, if this is a company, maybe your profit. If it's a utility company like a hydropower company, there might be consequences in terms of fees for the ratepayers, or there may be consequences in terms of brownouts that have occurred or what have you. So this is one scenario. It involves a particular sequence of choices, a specific choice. You get that? Specific choice over time followed by specific outcomes of the events, right? So it's like saying, wow, summer was a unusual summer. It was so hot, I didn't go out, for July, and then cooled off, and I was outside much more, and then it really warmed up during September, and I was outside a lot. That's a particular scenario. Whereas at the beginning of the year, you don't know what it's going to be like. You don't know what the temperatures can be. You don't know what your habits, what you're going to be deciding accordingly ahead of time. You don't know the particular choices you will make because you don't know what the situation will be that will be motivating those decisions. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a scenario. Okay, I'd like to talk about a decision rule here, okay? A decision rule will involve a sequence of choices to be made under any possible sequence of events. So this is an example of a decision rule. So here, a decision node, we choose what the outcome is. There's one value that we have the luxury of choosing. We do nothing initially. And then, for a decision rule, you have to handle any possible eventuality. You don't control the temperature. So if it's a lower temperature, you have to say what you'll do then. If it's a higher temperature, you have to say what you'll do then. That's an example of a decision rule. It specifies for any possible sequence of decisions or of events over time, what you will do. In this case, we've headed off all needing to worry about all these events on the top of the screen because we've chosen something. We've chosen to do nothing here. So all we have to worry about is this subtree, because we've chosen this. We have the luxury of doing that. But events, we have to handle all possible outcomes. Decision, here, week 1, we choose a particular outcome. Here, in the associated events, we have to handle all possible things. So this is one decision rule. This could be described to the health region and say, okay, this is a rule that tells you what to do. First week, you do nothing. Second, week 0, you do nothing. Week 1, if it's been a hot temperature, you do nothing. If it's been cool temperature, you also do nothing. In the third week, if it's a hot temperature and if it's a cold temperature, you do larviciding. That would be a rule that we could give to them. Now, this is a particular boring rule. Why do I say it's boring? Why do I say it's not taking advantage of flexibility? Why do I say it's simplistic? Yeah, no matter what happens in week 1, I'm making the same choice. Do nothing. This sort of rule, I could just tell them, week 0, do nothing. Week 1, do nothing. Week 2, perform larviciding. Do you see that? No matter what happens here in terms of this temperature in this sort of week 1 period, in week 2, I always larvicide. I'm not taking advantage of any flexibility. This is not contingent. This is not conditional on observation. It's a preset plan. We are sticking by a preset plan. We are staying the course. You can use different terms for it, but we just plan on something ahead of time, come hell or high water, come whatever we observe, that's what we're going to stick with. Do you understand that? Why this is a fixed decision rule? Okay, let's talk about an adaptive decision rule. Oh my gosh, this decision rule has been deformed. Okay, no, it's not the decision rule. It's the IT equipment that's deformed it. Okay, hey. Okay, here's it. What's going on? This is the most unsettling factor. We've entered the analog regime in a supposedly digital output mechanism. Okay, so this is an adaptive decision rule. Can anyone spot, why do I say this is adaptive? Why is this one contingent? Why is it conditional on what's observed? Can anyone spot that within here? Where's the spot where it's conditional? There's one spot that stands out here for being conditional. And what is it? It, ladies and gentlemen, stands. I feel I'm doing a profound disservice to my online students. What I'm actually seeing on my screen is kind of the opposite of what's shown. What I'm seeing on my screen is, so hey folks who are watching this remotely, this is the one I'm going to be talking about in just a minute, but I got to actually show it on the screen, on the big screen for my class locally, using, okay, now they're in sync. Okay, we're good. I have something like 400 subscribers who watch these things, and so I beholden to 2 classes, so excuse my muttering. So what is it that makes this contingent? Sorry?
Week 1?
Yeah, it's week 1. In week 1, if it's been a hot week in the previous week, then we do larviciding, otherwise we do nothing. You get that? So it's contingent. So we could specify this as a rule, and it's not merely week 0 do this, week 1 do that, week 2 do this other thing. Instead, it's, okay, In week X, if you have observed this, then do this. Otherwise, do that. You get that? And that's what we generally want. Why do we want it? Well, it turns out that these sort of static decision rules that pursue the same decisions over time, they're rarely optimal. Oh my gosh, this is a thing of great distress. So these static decision rules that stay the course, they're rarely optimal. The most effective decision making is often these adaptive cases, where you observe and you decide what to do. It's the difference between me telling you, based on intimate analysis historically of Saskatoon's weather, you should wear this thickness of coat on this day, versus a situation where you actually see what the temperature is that day before deciding. It would be a fool's errand in Saskatoon to map out what coat you should wear, what thickness of coat you should wear on any given day, because it's so variable for much of the year that you'd be sweltering in one day, freezing on another day because of my recommendations. Instead, it's much more effective to adaptively choose it. You got that? Okay. So the observation here, static decision rules are rarely optimal. Trying to say, do this optimal decision on these times is not going to generally get you very far in terms of the gains for these sort of problems, where what you do depends so much on what plays out over time. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about these situations a bit. So, we're going to talk about an example decision rule, and in a nod to the fact that this class is in CS, I'm going to use one from software development. So suppose you're developing a software product that's running on a certain OS. Maybe it's Mac OS, or maybe you're thinking about developing software for Windows 9, or maybe it's for Android. And you know that there's an OS upgrade that's going to be coming out down the road. You haven't seen it yet, but you understand it's going to have some really nice features for your software. And there's a question here. Are we going to rely on these features or not? You know, if we don't rely on them, we just ship, we might say, well, as a point of reference, we'll call that sort of a gain of 0. If we do rely on them, there's some risk because the OS may be delayed, in which case the release of our software product will also be delayed. Otherwise, the new OS release ships on time. Maybe we'll have some gain. We'll have more sales because we've adapted it to this particular release. We take advantage of the extra geolocating features in Android 5 or what have you. So we could associate different outcomes with these situations. And we could associate, what are these 0.1 and 0.9? Probabilities. You associate with each possible event outcome a probability of its occurrence. Do you do that for the choice? Why don't we see those for these choices? Why don't we see those probabilities for this? Yeah, it's no probability. It's just a matter you decide. There's no probability of it. You're choosing. Here, though, for an event, that's not under our control. There's a certain probability of each occurring. I should have emphasized it before. Each child of an event node has a certain chance of occurring. So we could have a situation like this where we depict a choice to be made now based on some uncertainties over time. We could associate consequences, guesstimates of how much we'd lose or gain for different outcomes, and then we could try to do what's called a rollback, which involves computing sort of what's the best choice to be made based on the expected values. And this is a process that's often depicted graphically, and it involves evaluating each node in a bottom-up fashion. Bottom-up, as you often see in dynamic programming, where you work back. Do you remember that? String, sort of least longest common substring, that sort of problem. You work up and backwards with it. So here, ladies and gentlemen, we start with the terminal nodes, and we work our way up. Okay, so what are the rules for doing this? Well, we'll come back to this in a second, because I should have a slide here on these rules. Oh, come on, is that slide hidden? I feel shocked. Okay, so pardon me for a second, because there's a set of slides on this that should definitely be visible, and let's see. Okay, no, we don't want to talk about risk preferences and attitudes. That's another lecture. Okay, chance event nodes. Okay, so where have all my slides gone on this? I am shocked. Okay, somehow there's been a defect in this. Okay, that's fine. I will just describe on the blackboard how to deal with these situations. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be 3 types of nodes that we talked about. And we're going to have ways of computing their values from the bottom up. For a consequence node, for this, we're associating it up front with an outcome. That outcome reflects sort of how bad or good that scenario is. Remember this notion of a scenario? Thing from root to a leaf node that's associated with a particular sequence of decisions and events over time. We associate that with some outcome, some measure of how good or bad it is. We saw that in that thing there where we said, okay, if the OS is delayed, we'll lose $200,000. If the OS ships on time and we've incorporated these features, we'll assume we gain $50,000 extra dollars. So for a terminal node, we just associate with a consequence. We assert that consequence. Yes?
Is there more than one consequence?
Yes, we can have more than, and that's called multi-attributed decision trees. And you can combine. There's several ways to do that. It's a whole topic unto itself. Books have been written on it. But broadly speaking, I'll mention 2 situations. One thing is if we have multiple outcomes, maybe costs and health outcomes, there's 2 ways we can basically, that I'll mention dealing with it. One way is you have some sort of way of combining them, like dollars per life year saved or something like that. So you combine them, dollars per quality, adjusted life year saved or something, right? So there you combine them in a single measure, right? Or you have some function of them that spits out a number given certain values for them. But dollars per quality adjusted life year saved is one example. A dollar per life saved, those are examples of measures. The second way is by reasoning about Pareto optimality and efficient frontiers, where it's a matter of you want the best gain with respect to one that doesn't harm the gain with respect to the others. And you're trying to rule out decisions that are obviously bad because there's something that's better with respect to both attributes compared to them. And that gets to sort of issues of efficient frontiers and this notion of Pareto optimality. But I'm not going to have time to go into that here. Okay? Okay, so for consequence nodes, you just estimate what the consequence is. Later, we're going to use the simulation model to do that. For a choice node, where you choose, a decision node, you're going to choose the best outcome, the outcome that's most favorable, the one that's most desirable. Why are we going to be, you're going to use the value of the best outcome. Excuse me, let me be very clear about that. Each of the children, we're working our way up from children, from the leaves to the root, from the bottom of the tree up. And by the time we get to the decision node, we therefore have values for each of its children. You got that? The value for each child. And we're going to use as the value for the decision node the best value for any of its children. Why? Because we're going to be able to choose the most desirable outcome. Does that make sense? We have the luxury of choosing here which one we want to which decision we want to make. So we'll choose the best one. Does that make sense? Okay. For an event node, can you choose here? Can you choose for an event node? No. You have to live with what you're dealt with, the cards you're dealt. And here, what the convention is to take the expected value of the values for the children. What do I mean by expected value in a statistical sense? Yep. So, let's draw each of those. I'll start with this one here, the expected value. It's the sum up for each child here of the probability of that child occurring times the value of that child. Okay? Call it VI. This is kind of the weighted average of the values of the children. If a child is very, very likely, it will tend to influence the value for the node more heavily, right? So this would be, if this is the event node, call it N. We're here dealing with what's the value for N based on its children, okay? Value for, well, we'll call it for an event node, right? For an event node E is, we go over all children of E, and we take the probability times their value. We figured out their value because we're working from the bottom up, right? Okay? For a decision node, the value for a decision node D, all right? What is that? Who could tell me? I said it before. It is it's the best. Let's assume for now that the best is the max. So it's the max over all children of D of the sub I. So it's the maximum one. It's the one we want the most. This is assuming more is good. If you're trying to minimize it, it'll be the min of them. If you have a thing where more of it is bad cost, you take the min. And for this one here, a terminal node, V of a terminal node, a consequence node, is just equal to the given consequence. It's just from the user consequence. Okay? Does that make sense? So, ladies and gentlemen, let's go back to our little example here. Okay. So, in our example, we're going to do a rollback. So, you folks can tell me, what's going to be, okay, well, the cat's out of the bag. Oh, no, it wasn't. Cat was out of the bag because a video card exhibited bugs. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, perform a rollback for me, unassisted by video card flakiness. Okay, so what's the value of this terminal minus 200,000? Minus 200,000. What's the value of this one? 50,000. 50,000. Gain of $50,000 versus a loss of $200,000 for those two different ones. Okay, given that, what is the value associated with this event node? So tell me how I'd compute it. 0.9 times 50,000, right? Plus 0.1 times minus 200,000. So 0.9 times 50,000 is 45,000 plus 0.1 times minus 200,000. 0.1 times minus 200,000 is minus 20,000. So it's 45,000 plus minus 20,000. In other words, 45,000 minus 20,000. In other words, $25,000. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So that's $25,000. And now tell me what is the value associated with this decision node. $25,000. It's the best of these two outcomes. And in that process, we're further doing, ladies and gentlemen, we're further indicating which choice we'd prefer. We take the max, and then we say the preferred choice for that decision node is the child associated with the maxed outcome. We cut off the other. Oh gosh, this is the most unacceptable graphics card performance. This is like Bug City. Man, those folks need to learn a thing or two from IEPI. So here we cut off this choice because it's unfavorable and we choose the top one. Is that right? Yeah, because that's the one that's most desirable in terms of the $25,000 outcome. Great. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we could make this more textured. Okay, so we can either rely on it. Okay, suppose the new OS is delayed. Okay, do we ship without regression testing against the final release of the OS? Do we get our system out there to the stores, or are we going to delay our product because the new OS is delayed? We're going to delay ours until after it's released. Or do we push our product out first so it can get into stores? This is an old example, shrink wrap software. Do we get it up early on the App Store, what have you, these days? This involves multiple decisions. This decision here, the second level of decision, only applies in the case the new OS is delayed. And then we have this tough decision. Okay, are we going to wait for the very latest release and be just as late as the OS, or are we going to get our system out there while we're not yet ready for the final release? People can use it against the beta or the release candidate version, and then it will be there in people's hands by the time the final thing is released. This involves some risk, because if there's uncaught bugs in the new OS release, in other words, if we haven't done the testing against the very final release of the software, we may be caught in a bad situation. Otherwise, if the feature support is as expected, there's no surprises in the final release compared to the release candidate, then we maybe lose less money. So here's a decision tree that involves multiple levels, and we can do the same sort of rollback on this. We can take this and we could successively roll it back, and this will give us a decision rule. It will tell us for any possible sequence of possible events over time. Here we get to choose the first thing. We say do rely on those features. We don't get to determine whether the new OS ships on time, but if it's delayed, we have to say what we would do. In this case, it's wait to do regression testing against it. Does that make sense? So we here are representing a situation of decision-making over time in the consequence of unfolding uncertainties. What are the unfolding uncertainties? Whether the OS is delayed and whether there are uncaught bugs associated with that delay. Ladies and gentlemen, software development is filled with risk management. And these sort of tools can be very useful for reasoning about those sort of decision-making. We just found a fix to this problem, but we don't have time to do full testing after making this fix. Our customer is rolling out tomorrow morning. Are we going to perform full testing against it? If so, the customer won't be able to roll out, they'll have to delay. Or should we not do testing against it because we're pretty confident in this rollout? That's the sort of thing that a decision tree can help you kind of balance on. You associate some rough guesses as to the probabilities involved into the outcomes, and you have a thinking prosthesis. You can do better than reasoning about it in your head. And you can write down a structured scenario to represent the situation. Does that make sense in terms of kind of representing things? Are people okay with that? Okay, so let's go on to talk about it. So decision trees we've seen can be used to identify optimal decision rules. This is optimal in light of the assumptions of the models involved, but the idea is the decision rule specifies what we should do given any possible eventuality. If this happens, if that happens, you have the luxury of saying what you choose, but within the constraints of those choices, you have to be able to deal with any possible eventuality. Okay? That's great. We saw this before, and we saw those rules. Okay. It turns out things you can do with this are really nifty. For example, you can ask, okay, often these are rough and ready probabilities we put into the decision tree, involving like the possibility that the OS will be late or that there's a surprise in terms of the support. We don't have a lot of good data. Often they're what are called subjective probabilities. They're guesstimates, we often will say. And so we can do with decision tree packages, we can do analysis that will say, for what ranges of these probabilities in that tree, for what ranges those probabilities associated with the event nodes, would one decision be preferable to another at the root? What would it take us, for example, to not rely on new OS features? What would we have to assume about the probability of the OS being late and about sort of the possibility of a surprise that would motivate us to then, say, okay, we're not going to rely on new OS features. We can do these sort of exploratory analyses involving assumptions about this decision tree and see, okay, how close are we to this boundary point where we choose A rather than B? Okay? Okay, multiple attributed decisions. I mentioned some things here. Okay, so let's talk about this hybrid approach. This is in the closing minutes, but I think we should be able to close the deal. So the idea here is that we have a model. In this case, maybe it's an SD model of West Nile virus. But it could be an agent-based model. It could be a discrete event model. It could be a hybrid model that we'll be talking about shortly. We want to combine it with a decision tree that will allow us to reason about uncertainty. And the idea here, the basic idea here is that the simulation model is going to calculate the consequences of sequence over time of events and choices. There's a bug in this slide. Let me get rid of it. And I don't mean a mosquito. Okay, there we go. So the simulation model is going to be responsible for calculating the consequences, ladies and gentlemen, of scenarios. You give it a scenario. I choose this at time 0, week 0. This type of weather occurs. I choose this at time 1. This other sort of weather occurs. I do nothing at time 2. This other sort of weather occurs, etc. You feed that to the simulation model. It calculates the consequences in terms of people getting sick from West Nile, in terms of number of deaths, or in terms of the cost expended to care for them, or what have you. Here, the simulation model takes care of simulation. Sometimes it's deterministic, sometimes not. Okay? But it's given the events and decisions that are specified to it. So it doesn't have to reason about the uncertainties associated with weather or temperature. It just simulates them accordingly. Okay, so what's the responsibility then of the decision tree? It represents the series of uncertainties and decisions over time. It represents consequences in the form of the event nodes, and it takes care of encapsulating the uncertainties in the policy space. It takes care of representing the possible set of choices and the uncertainties associated with it. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to highlight one thing for you. These consequences, these outcomes, from whence do those come? From the model, from the simulation model. Those consequences, ladies and gentlemen, are associated with particular paths over time, particular scenarios. This scenario, involving a single path from root to the terminal node, involves a specific sequence of decisions and events over time, and the simulation model is responsible for simulating that particular scenario and associating the consequence, this outcome of that simulation model is associated with this terminal node. Do you get that? So we could actually run the simulation model assuming this sort of thing has gone on and got a consequence. And then guess what we can do with that? Once we've run the simulation model for all of these different terminal nodes, what can we do then? We can do a rollback. We can compute this backwards induction, dynamic programming. We can compute, going back, which choices are optimal at each of these places. So in the event of a hot summer, do this. In the event of, if you had hot to this time, do this. Otherwise, and if it's been cool, do that. It can compute that from those consequences. Do you grok that? Grok or not? Okay, good. I see grokking heads. Okay. 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 So here, let's say for the West Nile case, what would be in the simulation model? Well, It might represent the mosquito population. It might represent the bird transmission, bird life cycle. It might represent transmission between mosquitoes and birds. It might represent human infection and the progression of human infection. Think susceptible, exposed, infective, recovered. It might represent the costs and the resource use that are associated with it, the costs associated with hospitalization and vaccination and all these other good things. Okay, so those sort of things might be represented in the decision model, in the simulation model. What would the decision tree represent? Well, here it might... The decision tree might represent the choices over time. A given decision node might represent the choice between source reduction, larviciding, doing nothing, in other words, waiting and seeing, and vaccination. Continuing to vaccinate, or maybe it's advisories. So advisory should be on here. It might represent uncertainties involving temperature, involving rainfall, or what have you. It might involve consequences. In other words, the decision tree might have consequence representing the number of severe neurological cases, or all West Nile virus cases, or all costs. That would be represented in the decision tree. And then we could use those sort of consequences as computed by the simulation model to do rollback on the decision tree. Say, if you're here, do this. Under these conditions, do that. Does that make sense? The Greek chorus is notable by its silence, but never once this semester has it spoken. So, in short, ladies and gentlemen, we can take these two seeming solitudes, a simulation model and a decision tree, and we can put them together rather readily with the right framework by associating them, for example, with associate each consequence of the decision tree with values from this SD model. The decision tree captures the uncertainties about things like temperature regimes, things that are not under your control and have a big impact on what goes on in the simulation model, and the choices to be represented. And basically what needs to go on in terms of choreography is the simulation, the decision tree, in order to simulate it, has to be able to tell the SD model, it has to be able to run it incrementally along each scenario. So it has to be able to tell the SD model, at time 0, we made a decision to, well, imagine that we're doing this here. We may tell it, at time 0, we've done nothing. At week 0, we've done nothing, and the temperature was hot. And at week 1, we did larviciding, and now simulate another hot week. And then in week 2, we do adulticiding. In that case, it would need to tell the simulation model what to assume as it runs forward. And then it could compute this consequence, this terminal node. Does that make sense? And then we perform that rollback after having computed all the consequences. So we have software that we created which does that. So you can give it a model, a simulation model, and you can give it a decision tree specified in XML, in which can be specified, it can be shown graphically, and it will do the rollback, compute the outcomes, give recommendations for these uncertainties. Real value for certain types of problems. Not every problem, but ones where your decision making, the impact of your choices to be made are disproportionately affected by these big uncertainties that are playing out over time, and where your choices are playing out over time in response to allow you to learn from what you observe. Make sense? Okay, so let's just motivate one more thing, and I'll let you folks go. So we have a very strong interest, in addition to sort of capturing models which can use these sort of, can be robust under these sort of uncertainties. It's also a real interest in this idea of self-correcting models. Models that are in some sense can be corrected as new data comes in that shows that they're off base with respect to their guesses as to the current situation. So you may have a model. This is all about getting our models to be humble, adding a bit of humility to our models, so that we know that our models are going to need to operate with incomplete knowledge of the world. They're going to be imperfect. I argued early on that models are like maps. They'll necessarily leave out information, and sometimes they leave out information that turns out to be important, or sometimes they just can't guess which way stochastics will go. They're going to be getting off over time further and further away from the observed situation, from the actual situation. And so much of this interest in sort of taking into account uncertainty can relate to this idea of having models that are self-correcting as well. Models that note, oh, you know, the mosquito population's a lot bigger than we thought it would be. Let's get our model back into line with what the data are showing. And if there's time in the remaining lectures, we may talk about a technique, or at least give a hint of techniques that will allow us to do that. There's two main techniques, Kalman filtering and particle filtering, which can be used to do essentially this sort of self-correction process. The deal is that our models are imperfect. They get further and further away, that diverge from observed data. And if we can use the observed data to bring them back into line, we can always have a model that's fresh, that can be used to plan going forward anew without the sense that it's just it's just more and more outdated in its assumptions. So we can bring noisy data in, data that's known to be fallible, known to be problematic, and we have model predictions that are known to be problematic. We bring them together and we create consensus estimates a consensus distribution of estimates that will allow us to go forward. Some of you, for your projects, are working with techniques to do exactly this. And those techniques form an additional layer for dealing with uncertainty in models. Because, ladies and gentlemen, one of the ways that dynamic models can do net harm is if we associate undue confidence in them. We associate levels of confidence which outstrip their ability to deliver. And if we put too much confidence in them, we may shortchange our other reasoning and find ourselves in a bad situation. But if we can keep our models humble and able to learn as new information comes in, we'll often be we'll be much less vulnerable to that. So, a few points I want you to take away from this lecture. I've presented a lot. This type of framework is geared to an ongoing process of observation decision-making. It captures uncertainty as the time progresses. It simulates a broad range of possibilities for temperature, not just a single scenario, and allows for staging of decisions over time. Incremental choosing over time rather than choosing upfront what we will do and sticking to it in some static sort of way. It can be used for diverse challenges involving planning over time in the context of big uncertainties that affect the trade-off between choices. And it offers some hints for a type of model that will self-correct from observations, that will sort of observe and make associated choices and how to proceed. So I will expect you to know how decision trees work and how to perform this sort of rollback and how a decision tree can fit in with a simulation model in the sense that the simulation model is used to simulate the consequences. Okay, you've been patient. I've kept you too long in the span after your vacation. I'd like to conclude now. I will be saying that I will be releasing imminently the final problem set for the course, and I'll send you mail to let you know when it is released. I recognize that because I was away last week, some people didn't get a chance to meet with me about projects, and I'm seeing if I can set aside time for those projects to make progress this week. So thanks very much.